Going for a bit of a different flow and format this time. Sure, we'll have some train videos, but this video is twofold. Number one, to test out a Yeti microphone that I have for the laptop that I use to edit videos sometimes. But secondarily, I was looking up books on the Gutenberg project. Not Police Academy Gutenberg, but the books Gutenberg. Basically books that are free use to use. And just looked up trains to see if there's anything there. And I found a wacky book from the 50s that I thought I'd read a bit of. I think it's a children's book. It's called Trains at Work by an author named Mary Elting. Published by Garden City Books in Garden City, New Jersey. But I'll start it out skimming it. It's pretty long for a children's book, but we'll see how this goes. If you're looking to relax or have kids that might be fire when they should be trying to rest, read a bit of this or listen to this, and hopefully it'll be boring enough to help them fall asleep as well. And I'll try to sync up some train videos in the background. So here we go. Trains at Work. Sam is a fireman. Sam is the fireman on a big freight locomotive. Like lots of people who work on trains, Sam belongs to a family of railroaders. His father was a locomotive engineer. His grandfather was one too. And, long ago, grandmother was an op. That means she operated the fast-clicking telegraph key in a railroad station. Her telegraph messages helped to keep the trains running safely and on time. When Sam was a little boy, he listened to his father and grandfather talking railroad talk. They used all kinds of words for ordinary people didn't understand. They had wonderful nicknames for each other and slang words for many of the things they did. For instance, grandfather called his big locomotive a hog. Since he ran it, he was the hogger. After every trip, he brought his engine to the roundhouse, where men cleaned it and fixed it all up. Pigpen was one nickname for the roundhouse. Can you figure out why? Another nickname was barn, because people often called a locomotive an iron horse. The barn had stalls for the engine. A modern roundhouse does too. The lumps of coal that grandfather's engine burned were called black diamonds. Fireman was the regular name for the man who shoveled coal, cleaned out the ashes, and helped grease the wheels with tallow fat. But the fireman also had a whole string of nicknames: Diamond Pusher, Ash Cat, Bakehead, and Tallow Pot. He called his shovel his banjo. Once an old-fashioned train began rolling, it was hard to stop it. A man had to run from car to car, putting the brakes on by hand. Naturally, he was the brakeman, but his friends called him the Shack. In the days before electric lights, railroads needed signals just as they do now. The first ones were large balls that hung from a tall post. A black ball hanging halfway to the top of the post meant stop. A white ball hanging high in the air meant clear track. Lots of things have changed since then. But a signal to go ahead is still the high ball, because railroaders still use many of the old words. Firemen and brakemen now have machinery that do many of the things they used to do, but they keep their old names. And one thing hasn't changed at all. People still love trains. The men who work on the huge, powerful engines would rather work there than almost anywhere else. That's how Sam feels about it. When Sam reports for work, his big steam locomotive is all ready. Men have oiled it and checked it. The fire is roaring in the firebox. In the old days, A fireman spent most of his time shoveling coal. The faster the train went, the more steam it needed, and the faster the fireman had to work with his banjo. Sam knows how to use a shovel if he needs to, but that's not his main job. His locomotive has a machine called an automatic stoker, which feeds coal into the firebox. Sam just checks up on the fire. He looks at dials and gauges in the locomotive's cab, and they tell him what he wants to know. There is enough steam. Everything is ship-shape. Sam and the engineer and a brakeman work the front of the train, so they are called the head-end crew. Another brakeman and a freight conductor work in the caboose, the last car on the train. In between the caboose and the locomotive are 60 cars of important freight that has to be delivered fast. A fast freight is called a hot shot or red ball. A slow one is a drag. Sam and the engineer are ready to go. Far down the track, the conductor raises his arm and gives the high ball signal. He is ready too. Now the engineer pulls the throttle lever. The long train snakes out of the freight yards onto the main line, and pretty soon they are battling the stack offer, which means making fast time. Sam on the left side of the cab watches the track ahead. The engineer sits on the right, keeping a sharp lookout. When they come to a curve, Sam looks back at the train to make sure everything is all right. After a while, they see a little town up ahead, and beside the track stands a signal that they have been expecting. It looks like a round plate with places for 9 lights in it, but only 3 of the lights are ever flashing at once. At the top of the page, you will see what each of the lights means. This time, 3 green go-ahead lights are showing. "Clear signal," Sam calls to the engineer. "Green eye it is," the engineer replied. All through the trip, he and Sam will call the signals back and forth to each other, just to make sure they are there and there is no mistake. The engineer gives one long blast of his whistle to tell the station agent at the little town that the train is coming. As they go past the station, Sam leans out of the cab and snatches a hoop from the station agent's hand. Quickly, Sam takes a piece of paper from it and tosses the hoop out again. In the meantime, the agent hands another hoop to the conductor in the caboose. The paper that Sam took off the hoop is a train order, called a flimsy. On the flimsy, the station agent has written instructions for the train's crew. Orders come to the station by telegraph. Sometimes they tell the crew that the train must make an unexpected stop at the next station. Sometimes they give information about other trains that have been delayed. Bigger stations often have train posts that stand beside the track, but small-town agents hoop the orders up by hand. Usually the agent has to walk along the track to pick up hoops that the crew tosses down. But the one who gave the orders to Sam has a dog trained to chase hoops and bring them back. Sam and the engineer and the brakeman read the orders to be sure nobody makes a mistake that might cause an accident. Back in the caboose, the other brakeman and the conductor read their copy of the orders too. Then the conductor goes to work at his desk again. The caboose is really his office. Then he checks the papers that tell where every freight car in the train is supposed to go. The brakeman pours himself a cup of coffee that's been heating on the stove in the caboose. Then he climbs to his seat in the cupola, the little tower with windows through which he can see the train. Squirrel Cage is a nickname for the cupola. The caboose has most nicknames of all. Crim, Crumbox, Crummy, Bounce, Doghouse, Parlor, and Monkey House are some of them. Safety is everybody's job on a train, and each man in the crew knows the rules. If the train makes an emergency stop, the men take care that no other train will bump into them. One brakeman runs out ahead and the other runs back along the track with signal flags to warn other trains. At night they take along fuses, which look like giant firecrackers and burn with bright red warning glows. Torpedoes are the best warning of all. The brakeman fastens torpedoes to the track with little clamps. Then, if a locomotive runs over them, they explode with a loud bang that tells the engineer to stop before he runs into the stalled train ahead. The first regular stop for Sam's train is a station where the tender is filled with water. The long string of freight cars waits here on a siding, while a fast passenger train floats by. On the next part of Sam's trip, the train has to climb some steep grades. One engine alone can't do all the work, so a helper engine couples on just ahead of the caboose. On the days when Sam's train is extra long and heavy, 2 helpers are needed. Going downhill in the mountains is work, too. Work for the brakes. In the old days, the brakeman had to run along the top of freight cars and club down. This means he used a long club called a sap to turn the wheels that set the handbrakes on each car. The catwalks or decks along the car roofs made a path for the brakemen. Sometimes they walked up and down inspecting the train. They said they were decorating. Fast freight cars, and slow ones too, now have air brakes which are squeezed against the wheels by compressed air. Every car has an air hose that runs underneath it to the brake machinery. The hose from each car can be joined to the hose on the ones behind and in front, and finally to the locomotive's hose. A pump in the locomotive compresses the air for the whole train. Now if the engineer wants to stop, he just moves a lever. A whoosh of air tightens the brakes on every car. When the train goes down a long hill, the squeezing of the brakes can actually make the wheels get red hot. Some freight trains have to stop and let the wheels get cool, but the cars in Sam's train have a sort of fan built into the brake machinery. The fan cools the wheels and the red ball freight goes right on down. After a while, Sam takes a little scoop and tosses some sand in the firebox. He knows the engine's flues are likely to get clogged up with soot, and the sand will clean them out. Later on, sand does an even more important job. The train has run into a storm in the cold, high mountains. Slushy snow has frozen on the rails. Instead of pulling ahead, the engine's wheels begin to slip round and round. But the engineer fixes that easily. He squirts sand onto the slick tracks to make the wheels pull again. The sand comes from the dome, which is the hump you can see behind the stack on top of a locomotive. Pipes lead down from the dome on each side and aim the sand onto the tracks just in front of the driving wheels. A locomotive sand is just as important as coal and water. Ice and rain or even dampness in a tunnel can make slippery tracks, so the railroads keep supplies of fine dry sand and filled the domes. Sam always checks to see if he has enough sand when the tender takes on coal. The huge coal towers tower in big freight yards and can fill several tenders at once. Often while the loading goes on, ashes from the locomotive's firebox get cleaned out at the same time. There's a dump pit under the tracks, with little cars that run on their own rails. After a little car is filled with ashes, it can be pushed away and unloaded at the ash heap. When Sam pulls into the next big freight yard, his part of the run is finished. After a while, he will board another engine and take another freight train back to his home. He has a regular schedule for work. That doesn't seem strange these days, but Sam's grandfather would have thought it was something miraculous. In the old days, grandfather never knew what time he'd have to leave for work. Sometimes when he was ready to blow out the kerosene lamp and go to bed, there would be a knock at the door. On the dark porch stood a boy, still panting from a bicycle ride up the street. He was the railroad call boy, and he'd come to say the engineer was needed right away. Grandfather had been assigned to the job, so he pulled on his clothes and went off, no matter how sleepy he was. The place where Sam leaves his train is called a division point. Other men will take it all over in the cars of the Red Ball freight and speed them on to another division of their trip. Let's see who these different train railroaders are and what they do. Unscrambling the trains. 60 freight cars have come roaring together over the mountains behind Sam's engine, but now the cars have to be separated. Some of them are going to Baltimore. Some will go north to Chicago. Others are bound south. Freight cars from 20 different cities are coupled together in one train, and somebody must unscramble them. Suppose you have a lot of colored beads on a string and you want to separate them into green and red and blue. The easiest way is to get 3 cups and let the beads drop off one by one, each into its own cup with the others of the same color. That's just what railroaders do with a freight train. Instead of cups, of course, they have a lot of separate tracks all branching off a main track. On one branch track, they collect cars that go to Baltimore. On another, cars going to Chicago. On another, the cars headed south. This system of tracks is a classification yard. In order to turn the cars from one track to another, there must be a lot of switches. A switch is made up of movable pieces of rail that guide a car's wheels. Look at the picture and you'll see how a switch guides a car either along the main track or onto a branch. Some of the most wonderful inventions in the world have been put to the work by big freight classification yards. First, the regular engine leaves the train and a special switch engine couples on. The engineer of the switch engine has a radio telegraph and telephone in the cab so he can listen to orders from the tower man, who unscrambles the train. The tower man sits in a tower beside the track at the top of a little hill called the hump. The main track goes over the hump and down, then divides into several branch tracks. If you uncouple a car just at the top of the hump, it will roll down the slope by itself. To make the car onto the right branch, the tower man works an electric switch. He just puts his little handles on the board in front of him, and electric machinery moves the switches in the track. On the desk beside him, the towerman has a list of tells him where each car on the train is and what city it is headed for. He knows which branch track should be used, track number 4 for cars going to Baltimore, track number 6 for Chicago-bound cars. Slowly, the switch engine pushes the train toward the hump. On the way, the cars pass over a big hole underneath the track. In the hole sits a man in a chair that can be tipped and turned, and all around are bright lights that shine on the underside of cars as they pass. This is the inspection pit. The man in the chair tilts this way and that, watching through a shatterproof glass to see if anything is broken or loose on the underside of the cars. When he spots a car that needs repairing, he talks with the towerman by radio telephone, and the towerman switches the car off to the repair track. Not all yards have radio telephones. In the ones that don't, the inspector pushes a button and squirts whitewash onto the car to mark it for repair. That's, of course, oldie time. Now the cars come close to the hump. A brakeman uncouples the first one slowly. It starts downhill. Then it gathers speed faster and faster. It hits another car that will be crashed. But like magic, something seems to grab all the wheels and slow them down. Something does rise up like fingers from the side of the tracks. It's the car retarder, which squeezes against the wheels and keeps the cars from rolling along too fast. The retarder works by electricity. The towerman just presses a button or a handle in the tower, and far down the track, the retarder machinery goes to work. But before rails had the machinery, brakemen went over the hump with the cars, working fast and hard to put the handbrakes on just at the right time. Brakemen who did this were called hump riders. Once in a while, a hump rider still goes with a car of very fragile freight that might be broken if it banged into another car the least bit too hard. Car after car drift down the hump and stop where it should. When one freight train has been unscrambled, another rolls beneath the tower, and its cars too are shuffled. In just a few hours, half a dozen trains have been broken up and made into new ones. Some yards have extra inspectors who stand on top of a building and look at the cars from above. They can see broken parts that the man in the inspection pit might have missed. In other yards, a man is stationed behind the track that leads up to the hump. In his hands, he holds something that looks like a gun. It's an oil gun. As each car passes, he takes aim and fires a stream of oil straight into the car's journal box. Not every freight yard has a hump of car retarders or radio telephones. Only the biggest ones have all these things. In many yards, the switch engine pushes the hull first onto one track and then onto another, dropping a car each time. There are several kinds of switch engine, built especially for the jobs, but switching is often done with very old engines that aren't fast enough for regular runs anymore. Railroadmen called these old wheezy engines tea kettles. An ordinary switch engine is a bobtail or a yard goat. Let's read more about the bobtails and yard goats in our next installment, shall we? Hopefully this has been a bit relaxing and you've watched some trains and perhaps you've started to doze off to sleep with any luck, because this is kind of boring with a capital D. Thanks for tuning in. As always, I thank you.